Hey, welcome to Citizen Mike Show. Thanks for tuning in. We do appreciate it. My name is Mike Brodinsky, and somewhere, I think, on that split screen is Steve Knight, former town councilor and regular opinion columnist for the Record Journal. Steve, thanks for coming on the show. We're going to have some fun tonight, I think.
You're very welcome. I'm honored to be here. I think we will.
Yeah, I think we will. So just some history from you and I, because not all of our viewers may know that because they're youngins. But you and I go back more than 20 years. You were on the council. I was on the council. You were on one end of the aisle. They say I was on the other side of the aisle. I don't know. But I think back then we agreed on absolutely nothing. And so it may be that tonight, I don't know, we may agree on absolutely nothing. But the goal tonight is a good faith search for common ground and to try to inform the viewers on this topic, critical race theory, hot button issue nationally. Are we in our right minds by trying to talk about critical race theory for an entire episode of the Citizen Mike Show? Is this nuts?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think it's that important. And as you've, in our discussions, as you've indicated, there's a lot of misinformation on both sides. And a lot of the rhetoric is pretty hot. And so I like to think that we can bring some, we may, I'm probably not going to agree, but I think we can bring some light to this, this heat.
Yeah, okay. I want to start out with some introductory materials. I want you to bear with me on this because I got to set the table for maybe a minute or two and change the screen over to the speaker end, maybe back to gallery. A little introduction to critical race theory, and then we're going to develop it. But the first piece that I picked, well, this comes from Media Matters, which is I think it's an online monthly blog. The article started out with this. It said, critical race theory, to those who can actually define it, is an academic and legal framework that examines the impact of systemic racism on American society. For conservatives, however, it's the latest boogeyman they can use to scare people into thinking America's children are being indoctrinated by woke leftist teachers. And while that is not even remotely the case, according to Media Matters, the idea is exploding on Fox News and in Republican state legislatures, leading to legislative bans in many states and skyrocketing mentions of critical race theory on the network. As Media Matters has previously noted, Fox News' current obsession with critical race theory has been a year in the making. What was once a slow trickle of monthly mentions has developed into a full-blown assault. And they track the times in May, June, July that Fox News has mentioned critical race theory. And in the July updates to this, which was as of July 14, it says, following the publication of this study, Media Matters continued to track mentions of critical race theory on Fox News. In June, there were 901 mentions on the network, the highest number of any month, and an increase from 537 mentions in May. In the past 3.5 months, there's been more than 1,900 mentions of critical race theory on the network. Part one of the introduction. Make notes, come back as needed when we're done with the introduction. But I want to now zip to a clip. We're lucky enough to have a clip, I think it's about 47 seconds, from the foremost authority on critical race theory in America today, a guy you and I love so much, and this fella calmly and rationally and factually explains critical race theory in terms that we can all understand.
Critical race theory takes that same Marxist concept, except it replaces class with race. And it says all of America and all of the world is a battle between the races. Critical race theory says every white person is a racist. Critical race theory says America is fundamentally racist and irredeemably racist. Critical race theory seeks to turn us against each other, and if someone has a different color skin, seeks to make us hate that person. And let me tell you right now, critical race theory is bigoted. It is a lie. As a Christian and as an American, I love my brothers and sisters, whatever skin color you are, whatever ethnicity you are, whatever faith you are, whatever creed you are. We are commanded to love, period, the end.
A final piece before we get you to weigh in on this. And this piece comes from a little newspaper in Platteville, Wisconsin that I visited recently, written by a local columnist that is sort of, the column that you'll see, it sort of reviews what's happening in Wisconsin today. And it starts this way. A few hours after a divided Wisconsin assembly, Wisconsin thought of as a red state, by the way, a few hours after a divided Wisconsin assembly passed a bill Tuesday that would ban the teaching of concepts like systemic racism and implicit bias, University of Wisconsin Platteville professors led a presentation to dispel misconceptions concerning the academic discipline that has become entwined with the controversy. The lecture on the subject of critical race theory characterized the discussion of the concept as misinformed and unnecessarily divisive over what is an esoteric subject of academic study in law schools. Quote, critical race theory is not taught in grade school or even in general undergrad courses, said this professor from the University of Wisconsin Platteville. The echo chamber of misinformation leads to major outrage. The author's bill, a guy, Chuck Widgers, provided a list of 88 prohibited concepts, including CRT, implicit bias, restorative justice, emotional learning, affinity groups, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. He said history is not a morality play. The purpose of history is not to denigrate anybody. But he goes on to say that history can be messy. And there are instances where its members of society, the United States society, have not lived up to its values. Slavery, for instance. Coming to the end, Steve. The movement against the theory gained traction last year when former President Donald Trump signed an executive order barring federal contractors from conducting racial sensitivity trainings. Several state lawmakers subsequently inserted language from Trump's now defunct order into their own bills. Goes on to say that critical race theory is not taught in Platteville School District, the superintendent said. Steve, I'm going to turn to you, but I want to turn first to this question. Has your view of critical race theory changed as a result of our preparation for this episode of the Citizen Mike Show? If so, how and why?
Well, it's mellowed because anytime you do more research than watching television and reading opinion magazines, you will learn more about the other side. That's unusual in today's political environment. So I thought it was good training, good preparation and good training. That goes for almost any issue I can think of where if we're exposed in an adult way to an opposite point of view, without having everything all chopped up and hysterical, then I think it's important. I'll tell you where I got a lot of my research. It was very quick. I wanted to do opposing points of view. So I used the Heritage Foundation for the more conservative point of view, and I used the Brookings Institution for the more left-leaning point of view. And my fears have not subsided by learning what Brookings, one of their people had to say or wrote. But I also see that there's no question that the overgeneralizations as to its how radical it is not helpful either. Now, I also went on a website that's by UMass, umassglobal.edu, and they're offering a course in Let's Talk About Race. And if we had time, Mike, I would read some of what they're claiming this course is for, and what they intend for you to do with it. So, and it is, as far as I'm concerned, quite radical. I don't think it's education. I think it's indoctrination. And I see a lot of that in the academic world now. Not that I'm in it, but certainly you read plenty about it. A lot of academicians don't cotton well to being criticized on this subject. And that article from the Wisconsin papers was pretty balanced, given its the origin of the the college or university person. Yeah. Anyway, having said that, I don't know if I've answered your question, but I think anytime in any, let me just back up. I'm going to give you another example. Homosexuality. Well, 20 years ago, I really had some, I didn't know much about it. I did not know very many gay people. And then my daughter came out, my younger daughter. And of course, I didn't, my family thought I'd go bananas, but I didn't, because it's my daughter and I love her. But boy, in the last 20 years, have I learned a lot about gay and lesbian life. It's, you wouldn't believe it. And I've seen other conservatives, if I may say, and I don't, that might have had my opinion, and then one of their kids came out. And boy, I mean, I'll tell you, there's nothing like that for enlightenment. And that'll go for anything you study. And if you study it honestly, sometimes you're forced into it because, well, in my case, because my daughter came out. But there's always room to learn.
So what I'm hearing, I'm going to interpret this my own way. What I'm hearing is a general proposition. The deeper you look into a subject, the more likely you are to move a little bit in the sense of at least understanding the other side, not necessarily agreeing with the other side, which may turn down the temperature on the discussion of these hot button topics like critical race theory. My personal takeaway after preparing actually hours for this episode and reading about critical race theory, I've decided personally that the word racist is not helpful to anyone if they're going to have a serious discussion about critical race theory. That using the word racist liberally, in conversations or in print when describing this, that, and the other, using the word racist tends to turn people off and close their minds, and people tend to dig in rather than open their minds to the other perspective. And so to the extent that I can, I'm not using the word, or I'm not adopting the word racist. I may be wrong. Maybe the purist on critical race theory may think that the word racist is a necessary word to use. I'm not buying it for the purpose of this show. And when I think of substituting the word racist for another expression, what I think is of the impacts or disparate impacts, unfair different impacts, primarily of African Americans. It's broader than that, but I'm going to, again, for the purpose of the show, stick with that. Unfair impacts based upon race that have causes that have been baked into the law, society, and institutions over the years. And those impacts, some people will call those are racist impacts. I'm not doing that. I'm trying to stick with that description that I just described to you. I also want to give my interpretation of of what this is again. I think American history is a bit of an interest of mine, and I've read on it from college days on. A lot of ways of looking at American history. You can track American history through, let's say, the history of the Navy and maritime commerce, and track that through the beginning of the country up to the present time. And when you study maritime history and the U.S. Navy, you don't get a broad, comprehensive slice of American history. No, you don't. You get it from the perspective of a naval officer or developments in the Navy. And the same thing can go for, let's say, science, economic development, and inventions. You can trace the history of the United States through that lens and focus on, the steam engines and railroads and electricity and telephone and so on and so forth. That is sort of one lens or one perspective of American history. You can do it more traditional way, is tracking American history through a political history, the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution to the presidents, and then go from one president to the other president and discuss what happened under each presidency. You can do that too. And that, again, gives you a slice, one perspective of American history. You can do that with the military too. Critical race theory does it through the lens of race, and they track the evolution of race relations from the beginning of the United States, the origin of the United States, through the present time. And critical race theorists would ask, are there any legacy impacts of race relations through the ages that exist today? And that's how I kind of view and put in perspective critical race theory. I'm going to go to my Brookings column, but I want to get your reaction to what I just said.
That there's a lot to unpack there, Mike.
Yeah.
But as far as the critical race theory theorists are concerned, what bothers me and what I read is that that indeed there were cultural and economic and political impediments that have worked against Black people for most of the history of the United States and most of the history of the world, frankly. And I think especially since 1964, I think the country, I am proud of the progress that the United States has made in this area. Is there work to be done? Yes. Is there a modification that should be done, and how the difficulties that Black people suffered should be outlined and brought more prominent in reading and writing history? Absolutely. Having said that, what bothers me about the race CRT people, scholars, they say that U.S. social institutions, and this is a quote from Rashawn Ray. You may have read some stuff on Brookings with him, e.g. the criminal justice system, education system, labor market, housing market, and healthcare system are laced with racism embedded in laws, regulations, rules, and procedures that lead to differential outcomes by race. That's a pretty broad statement. That's quite the indictment of our entire economic and political and cultural system. And that's his definition of critical race theory. He looks at the United States as, and it would seem that he looks at the United States as irredeemable. And if that's the case, we're just going to end up going to war with each other. And that, I fear, there are people that actually benefit from it through increased publicity, increased speaking dates. They make a living, they dine on it. And all it does is put each other at each other's throats. So
okay,
that's my comment from now.
Yeah, right. I think I have the same Brookings article that you do. I want to read some different passages from it, though, and maybe
Okay,
maybe we can get closer together. Maybe not. I don't know. But we're making the effort, I think.
there you go.
So this is from a Brookings Institution article from August 2021. And one of the paragraphs starts this way. To understand why critical race theory has become such a flashpoint in the culture, it's important to understand what it is and what it's not. Opponents fear that critical race admonishes all white people for being oppressors while classifying all Black people as hopelessly oppressed victims.
I read the
These
same
fears
stuff.
have spurred school boards and state legislatures from Tennessee to Idaho to ban teachings about racism in classrooms. However, there's a fundamental problem. These narratives about CRT are gross exaggerations. Critical race theory does not attribute racism to white people as individuals or even to entire groups of people. Simply put, critical race theory states the US social institutions, and this is the sentence you read, may have legacy effects, and this is now my words, I'm diverging from the Brookings article, may have legacy effects. And we're going to get to some examples later in the show. But sociologists and other scholars have long noted that racism can exist without racists. That is a kind of a mind-bending concept. I'm not asking anyone to agree or disagree, and we're going to get into this in more detail. But to say that racism can exist without racists is sort of a strange notion to some. Makes you think, and that's all I'm asking with this Citizen Mike Show episode. However, many Americans are not able to separate their individual identity as an American from the social institutions that govern us. These people perceive themselves as a system. Consequently, they interpret calling institutions racist as calling them racist personally. And this is why I said in my opening remarks, the word racist does not help the conversation. The word racist means different things to different people, but in discussing critical race theory, I would eject the word racist and use this disparate impact based on race, based on laws and customs that have become embedded in the system. You may not even notice. You may not even know that that's happened. We're going to get to examples. Let me just read one more thing. Scholars and activists. This is for you, Steve. I want you to make a note. I want you to come back hard. Scholars and activists who discuss CRT are not arguing that white people living now are to blame for what people did in the past. They're saying that white people living now have a moral responsibility to do something about racism that still impacts all of our lives. That's from that same article. Your reaction to what I just read.
I wrote down that quote as well, Mike. Let's start with the word scholars and activists.
Okay.
We as soon as we call people scholars and activists, they all in certain circles seem to achieve some legitimacy. And scholars, scholars in today's college or university environment, and especially some of the stuff I saw today, it's hardly scholarship. It's not scholarship. As far as activists, well, of course, activists are they may not be saying that white people living now are to blame for what white people did in the past. They're saying that white people living in now have a moral well, we've had a moral responsibility forever let's say since 1865. We haven't lived up to that responsibility. And ever since 1964, I think we've done a lot of good work to live up to our moral responsibility. And I'm sorry to say, but some of the stuff that I have read from the activists is that they want to right those wrongs. They want to balance our history going forward with special exceptions and a denial of the Judeo-Christian values that all of us grew up with. And that's their way of balancing the scale. And I don't buy that. I don't think that, one, it's impossible to change anything that happened in the past. And if we use this as our way forward, I think we're in for a very, very difficult time in our society.
So I want to read something for you that addresses your point. And by addressing your point, meaning not proving you wrong, but responds to the same topic. And I would just ask you and the viewers to find, rather than emotionalism on either side, try to drill down into the factual basis of this. Let me just read this to you. Don't blow a cork though until I get to the end, and then corks can be blown. This is the show to blow corks. Okay. Fundamentally, this is from Education Week, an article in Education Week. I think you've seen that too.
I have.
Yeah. So fundamentally, though, it reads, the disagreement on critical race theory springs from different conceptions of racism. And again, it's that word that grinds on me. I don't like, but it's here. I'm reading it. CRT puts an emphasis on outcomes, not merely on individuals' own beliefs, and calls on these outcomes to be examined and rectified. Among lawyers, teachers, and policymakers and the general public, that's us, we're the general public, there are many disagreements on how precisely those things, to do those things, and to what extent race should be explicitly appealed to or referred to in the process. Here's a helpful illustration, they say, on Education Week. In 2007, a US Supreme Court school assignment case on whether race could be a factor in maintaining diversity in kindergarten through grade 12, Chief Justice John Roberts' opinion famously concluded, this is for you, Steve, this is for you, okay? The way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. Fair point. But during oral arguments, then Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, it's very hard for me to see how you can have a racial objective, but a non-racial means to get there. Point I'm making, this is tough stuff. Tough stuff. There is a disagreement among the right and the left, or the CRT and the anti-CRT, on the means and methods to achieve, I think, what your vision is, which is pretty much the same as my vision. Can't we sort of come together and get rid of these disparate impacts, and you would say racism? Isn't there a way to come together? And this is the battle. There is still disagreement on how to do it. And it's why I showed the Ted Cruz clip, because Ted Cruz is not helping try to find a way to solve this. Your thoughts on my thoughts while I change the subject a little bit.
Okay. First, Ted Cruz, understand he's a politician. He was at a Faith and Freedom Coalition event, and he was throwing red meat at him. Okay, I mean, that's what politicians do. You watch AOC in front of her crowd, and she does the same thing. So let's start by understanding that quote. It's a video. He did say these things. So in context, out of context, he did it. But that's why that's why we love Cruz. I mean, he's bombastic.
So I'm saying, and I think you're saying too, please let's not be Ted Cruz's.
Yeah, really. Now, you've used it, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg talked about outcomes, and you used the term disparate impacts.
Yes.
Now, one of the things that I find very disturbing is that to the extent that the Black population has way too much poverty and a lack of opportunity is not entirely, or even, and it's not entirely due to racism. There are, if you check the demographics in, if you could say this about the Irish 120 years ago, they lived in poverty, they were discriminated against. It's different for Black people because because of the history of the United States. But there are Black scholars, there are Black, very intelligent Black people like Shelby Steele and so forth, that say you have to look beyond the color of the skin. There are other factors that are harming the Black population, and if we overlook those and only try to correct this amorphous racial blame game, if we don't look at the other reasons that Black people are disadvantaged, then they're never going to get out of that. We have to be honest with ourselves about the Black community. And the Black community has to be honest with themselves. And this is Mr. White Boy talking, but nevertheless, I ain't no liberal, but by God, I'd love to see every Black person in the United States have a good job and a good family and a good house and a good everything, live anywhere they want. But it's going to take some hard work.
Well, I'm not a proponent or a detractor of critical race theory. What I am against is the misinformation and exaggeration and the inflammatory rhetoric that often goes along with it. And
you and I are in total agreement on that.
Oh, good. Okay, but I'm going to make a note.
Okay.
Let me read some stuff. Some stuff
Right.
because I'm trying to get down to concrete examples that I found in writing that may inform what we're talking about. This comes from an article by David Brooks, no liberal, as I understand, sort of a moderate Republican kind of guy, and he's talking about critical race theory, and he says, "Is racism mostly a part of American past?" And he says there are many ways to answer these questions. The most important is by having honest conversations with the people directly affected. And as you point out, we're two old white guys that haven't consulted any African Americans on the subject. And so we got an information gap, and I think we got to put that disclaimer out. You know, maybe one day in the Citizen Mike show, we'll be able to get some Black spokesmen on and give us their perspective, because that's absolutely more important, I think, than what we have to say. But we're trying to set the table for that. He goes on to say another answer is by asking, how high are the barriers to opportunities for different groups? Do different groups have a fair shot at the American dream? And then skipping a paragraph or two, he says, research shows the role racism plays in perpetuating these disparities. These are the disparate impacts that I've been talking about. Mm-hmm. When in 2004, researchers sent equally qualified Black and white applicants to job interviews in New York City, dressed them similarly, and gave them similar things to say, Black applicants got half as many callback or job offers as white applicants. David Brooks saying, we're still living with that consequence. I'm going to move on. We can agree or disagree.
No, wait, let's not move on. Let's talk about that for a second. I cringe every time I read something like that. I cringe because I to the extent that it still exists, it's wrong and it's got to be stamped out. I'm not naive enough to think that it is there. It doesn't exist, but that's anecdotal, and there's lots of anecdotal evidence. They might be larger issues than that. I like to think, but there was in that particular, I read that too from David Brooks, and it makes me sad to know that this still exists, and it's a very, very difficult thing to overcome, because it is within the soul of each individual. You can only control your own, ultimately, you can only control your own soul and your own attitudes. And there's no reason not to work on it and to try to eliminate this bias. But it is a very,
You're frustrated by it.
Well, yeah, and I don't think you can legislate out of it. I think you can certainly educate better about what, and listen more carefully to people that have suffered this discrimination. But there's more to it than just the racial discrimination part. That's all I'm saying. Is
I know, and your point is well taken. I think if this was not an experiment and a research project, and you're a Black applicant for a white collar job, and let's say in Manhattan in the financial district, this is going on, and you say, you know what, Steve Knight is absolutely right, but I'm disadvantaged by that, because research shows I don't have an equal shot. That's the perception. I got some other examples, so I don't want to get too bogged down.
Okay, all right.
And you'll keep your powder dry. There's a lot of stuff here. So this comes from Economist magazine, which I have very high regard for, and it talks about discrimination in the armed services in very subtle ways. And it talks about the chief of the U.S. Air Force and how he has been presented with some disparate impacts, and he's trying to figure it out. It's not easy how to figure it out. Here's what Economist says: disparities actually in the officer corps, Black versus white, disparities have deep roots. Quote, "Our screening programs have some level of unconscious bias," acknowledges General Brown. "I did not know until 3 or 4 years ago that we have private pilot time that you can use to boost your score to get into pilot training." I'm going to digress and explain that a little bit. The pilot training is very competitive, and I guess in order to get into pilot training, there's a score basis, and the higher scoring candidates for a pilot school make it. Lower scoring people don't, and so the scoring matters. And so the general goes on to say, "I'll just say that when I was in high school or college, my parents did not have money for me to do that, to go to private pilot school. Yet private pilot school and the experience that you got privately that costs money serves to boost your score of white pilot candidates more so than Black pilot candidates." So says not Mike Brodinsky, but the chief of the Air Force. Let me just get to one more. This is subtle. This is subtle.
I would love to comment on this, because there's more to it than that, Mike.
We're going to come back. We're going to make a note.
Okay.
We're going to come back.
All right. Okay.
The mechanics, this is also the same article from the Economist magazine talking about the U.S. Air Force. It says the mechanics of promotion are also stacked against minorities in subtler ways. In each service, older mentors can boost the careers of favored younger officers at key junctures of their career. That often benefits graduates of elite colleges like West Point at the expense of those who entered through less prestigious routes. It is to address this imbalance that General Brown meets weekly with his staff to examine promotions to colonel and above, to identify diverse candidates down to the level of majors who may have spent only a decade in service. You can't do it by luck, he says. You have to purposefully manage it. I want to talk to you first about General Brown and then open mic for Steve Knight. Is General Brown approaching this the right way? Do you think he's going overboard?
I think the information's a little incomplete. There's always been in the armed forces. There's always been, it's a huge bureaucracy, and who you know can indeed. That goes for any business, but especially in the military. If you're befriended by the right people, you're going to fast track. And I don't, and it would seem to me, and I'm sorry if I'm naive again, but that I always thought that African Americans got they enter the military voluntarily in numbers much greater than their percentage of the population. It leads me to believe that they find the organizations a good place to be.
Well, should these disparate impacts, and the impact clearly is disparate, a ton more white pilots than there are black pilots. You would point out, and you have, there could be a lot of reasons for that. But General Brown has put his finger on one contributory reason. And so my question is he off base? Yeah.
Look, I don't, again, we're dealing with incomplete information. Why is private pilot training, first of all, why does it give you a higher score? Just because you got some hours in an airplane? Or is it because through this early training in your life that you are essentially a better pilot than somebody's just entering training? If you put them side by side, who's got more experience? Does that make you a better pilot? Now, if the thing is, if those points are given without any consideration for whether there's any value to this private pilot training, then perhaps it should be eliminated. But the other part of it is, it's not racial discrimination, it's economic discrimination. That's what you're speaking of. Yes, economically, the Black community overall is at a disadvantage. And it'll show up because more white kids go get their pilot's license than Black kids. But there are more rich white kids than there are rich Black kids. That's economics, not race.
One theory would be that the disparate economic situation, the wealth gap, is a legacy effect of racial discrimination, of rule systems, customs baked into the system, which creates and perpetuates a wealth gap and unequal opportunities. And the challenge presented by critical race theory is, do you got the guts? Yeah, do you got the guts to go back and say what caused this to happen, and not blaming anybody, but then go on to say, should we try to rectify it? Critical race theory says we should try to rectify it. I'm hearing anti-critical race theorists say, no, we shouldn't. It's economics. It's economics. Don't worry about it. It'll work itself out.
No,
No.
But listen, let's take one example. Everybody knows that the best ticket out of poverty is a good education. We spend a fortune on public education in this country. We especially spend a fortune in the minority community on education. But how many articles have you read, Mike, where it's the phrase kids trapped in failing schools comes up?
Yeah.
And that's why we have charter schools. That's why we have magnet schools. And when those schools are available, good minority parents jump all over the opportunity to put their kids in those schools. We've got to make those more available. Yet the education industry, in large measure, fights charter schools tooth and nail. But they're proven to help people that are stuck in poverty escape that poverty. Again, it is some of it's economics. A lot of it is economics. We are offering opportunities in many, many, many areas.
So I want to move on, staying on your topic, but I want to move on a little bit because you mentioned education. I just have one paragraph, and then I want to move on if I can. And this comes from an opinion piece in the Hartford Courant. In terms of the field of education, applied critical race theory asks us to look past and present educational policies, such as funding for education based on local property taxes that continue to promote inequality, and to think about productive ways to change the laws or the policies to promote more equity. More equity would be more charter schools. I don't care who's in favor of charter schools, who's blocking charter schools. I don't care, about the Connecticut Supreme Court case, which acknowledged that Connecticut is a very segregated state when it comes to education. That's the impact. That's the disparate impact. The challenge is, do you brush it aside and say there's nothing we could do, it's all economics, and we should abandon our efforts to confront the obstacles to inequality, or do we let it go? That's the challenge. I know you got a lot to say, but I got to move on. There's another topic. Keep your powder dry. You will have time. But this is one of my favorite stories on this whole segment of the Citizen Light Show. And it involves really why this is in the news, why critical race theory is in the news, the intersection between critical race theory and public education in the lower grades. This is really why it's exploded. And my favorite story is reporting on Senator Rob Sampson. We know him. He's our favorite ultra-conservative right-wing Republican from Wolcott. Now, you could say he's a fair-minded liberal guy, but this is a story about Rob Sampson. Rob Sampson, a Republican from Wolcott, attempted to pass an amendment on June 7 that would prohibit public schools from teaching divisive concepts. Steve, we don't want that. We don't want divisive concepts and content that makes any individual feel discomfort. I was uncomfortable in French, in fourth year French. Anyway, we can't teach divisive concepts and content that makes any individual feel discomfort. I was uncomfortable in algebra. Wait a minute, let me finish. I got to finish. Okay. Guilt or anguish or any other form of psychological distress. So little Johnny comes home and says, Mommy, I have psychological distress. They told me a story about slavery. Let me just finish reading. On account of an individual's race or sex. Quote, I firmly believe that we got to get a hold of our education system in this state, in this country, and remind the next generation that America is the greatest place on earth because people should be treated equal under the laws, he said on the Senate floor. When Senator Sampson was asked by Senator May Flexer, a Democrat from Killingly, to give specific examples from school curricula in the state, he responded, it's been happening all across the country. Sampson did not return requests for comment for this story, but in a letter to the editor in the Current, Sampson said he did not have time to prepare research before his amendment was called. Though Sampson's amendment failed, it earned the support of every Republican in the state Senate. And in an email to his supporters after the vote, he encouraged residents to contact him if you know of efforts to incorporate critical race theory in our schools. Another example is Guilford. We'll get to that in a minute. And I think also in Greenwich. But your thoughts on my Rob Sampson story?
Okay, so when he defined it, one, I don't know how you could possibly, you've got to do a better job defining what you really mean. But let's just take this word divisive. Critical race theory, in my mind, from my point of view, is divisive. Just on the face of it, it's divisive, because and you could read the stuff that you can quote, it divides people. It divides people by color, and that is not healthy for this society. It is not healthy. It's especially not healthy for minorities, because one of the tenets of this CRT is that because this systemic racism is so rampant and so embedded in so many cultural and economic places in our society that minorities cannot possibly overcome and prosper. So how do Black parents tell their kid that they can do anything they want if they get a good education when they go to school and they're told that they're screwed?
Well, the problem, let me stop. They're not told that. There's no evidence they're being told that. That is a myth. That's the problem. There's very little to no evidence that this is being taught in the schools, except on Fox News, except on Tucker Carlson. It is
race on red. Systemic racism can explain racial disparities in police killings, COVID-19, and the devaluing of homes in Black neighborhoods.
Yeah.
How do you come up with that?
Well, who came up with it? Was it taught in 8th grade?
This is a guy that's teaching, that's promoting critical race theory.
So I need to get your,
divisive?
We're running out of time, so I need to get your pithy view of the extent to which you believe critical race theory is taught in the grades and your sources for that.
I don't have sources for that. And I'm not that claim right now, but I think people are alarmed at the how much ground critical race theory has gained in the last year or two. And when they start to examine it, if they do what you and I have done, is start to examine the facts of the matter, then I would agree with you. I don't think it's as extensive and widespread as many columnists would lead you to believe. Having said that, I don't see any reason why we shouldn't have a very careful examination of just what we want to improve race relations in this country. And I do not think critical race theory does that.
Critical race theory may or may not, and that's not my point in this conversation. My point is critical race theory is not taught in the schools. There's no evidence that it is. It's used by the Ted Cruzes of the world to gin up opposition, to raise money, to say, stop critical race theory, send $10 now. And when Board of Education after Board of Education across the country is asked about, do you teach critical race theory? They say no, and the teachers say no, and the people in the field, on the ground say no. Yet the Republican politicians say, we think it is. I need to read you a letter to the editor in connection with the Guilford experience. Because when I read about the Guilford experience, I see Tammy Raccio and let's say Ray Ross in the same position as some incumbent Board of Ed members in Guilford, Republicans in Guilford. This is a story about a Republican primary in Guilford. So there were seats open in Guilford and the Republican ticket. This is not Republican versus Democrat. This is all a Republican story. The primary, a time came up in Guilford, and some hardline activists in Guilford were very insistent that a critical race theory had to be scrubbed out of the Guilford school system. So they got together and they challenged the incumbents in a primary. The incumbents said, Republican incumbents, Steve, said, we don't teach. This is Tammy Raccio, Ray Ross. I mean, it's not them. They come to mind when they say, no, we're not doing that. And the superintendent of schools said, we're not doing that. But the hardline anti-CRT activists said, we think you are. And the activists kicked out the incumbents on the basis of nothing. I just want to read a letter to the editor to you because we are running out of time, but it's from a teacher in Haddam. It says, we must teach our kids the truth. Among those running for the Board of Education in Guilford, that's the story that I was describing, is Nick Asano, whose words appeared in the current article, Battle over Critical Race Theory Moves to the Ballot Box as Republicans Seize on the Issue in Connecticut School Board Elections. Why would anyone with children vote for Cassano's narrow approach to history? Why should they fear students learning about the Tuskegee Airmen, the Navajo Code Talkers, the role of women whose contributions in the defense industry were crucial to the Allies' victory? I never learned about these heroes in high school, just as I missed out on the Japanese internment camps, Native Americans being pushed off their lands and denied their cultures, the Tulsa Massacre, etc. I consider that deplorable. When I became aware of these omissions, I did not feel bad because of the color of my skin. I felt that I'd been cheated out of a whole segment of history, and my ignorance may have skewed my vision of who I was in the world, where so many are treated as others and not as equal partners in our grand vision of America. If teachers like me are there to teach, let them teach the truth. And we all know the cliche about ignoring the past, which, by the way, is never the past. Similar letters of the editor from teachers saying, let us teach the truth. Don't confuse a discussion of race relations over the ages. Don't confuse that with critical race theory. Don't engage in overkill and broad brush accusations that could threaten to scrub out an honest teaching of race relations in America. And don't call it divisive. If the truth is divisive, the truth tellers don't have a problem. Let me finish. It's not the people who tell the truth. It's not their fault. If someone says the truth is divisive, the answer is not to stop telling the truth. Steve, you're the guest. You've got the final word.
Okay. Divisive. We started this conversation talking about critical race theory. Yeah. Critical race theory is divisive. Teaching about the Tuskegee Airmen, the Navajo Code Talkers, all that is fascinating. And you and I were denied that when we were kids. You read the textbooks. I read the textbooks. I read a little autobiography about George Washington Carver, but that's all I ever. It may be a paragraph in our textbook. These need to be corrected. I said that 50 minutes ago or whatever it was. I absolutely think that we need to raise awareness of the contributions of minorities in our country, and we need to honestly take a look. What am I trying to say? We need to understand the complete American history. But to when you go into the schools and you start teaching critical race theory, which says that we have our systems, many of our systems are, quote, laced with racism embedded in laws, regulations, rules, and procedures. If you teach that all day long, and you don't teach and you want to teach the history, but if you teach what I saw in this one course, let's talk about race, then you're not teaching. You're not teaching truth. You're propagandizing. You're teaching your point of view.
Well, let's make that the final word, except for my final word, because it's my show. It's not being taught. It's not being taught. It's only being taught in the imagination of people that have been whipped up by Ted Cruz and the like. The more you read, the more you come across observations, comments, evidence, statements by teachers and superintendents of schools and Board of Ed members that say, we're not doing that, yet people persist in believing that we are, so we get kicked out of office, as in Guilford. So let's sign off. I want to thank you for coming on, and thank you viewers for watching the Citizen Mike Show.